In the 1930s, the Soviet Union was starving. Millions died, not from drought or war, but from an idea: the collective farm. Villages emptied. Families watched their children grow thin, while the grain they harvested disappeared into state warehouses. The fertile black earth that had fed the empire for centuries became a landscape of death. The only thing that stopped the famine from consuming the entire empire was a tiny, grudgingly permitted patch of private land. Household plots carved behind barns and along fence lines, worked by hand with simple tools. By the late 1930s, these slivers were delivering nearly half the milk, meat, and potatoes people actually ate. 3% of the land fed an empire, while the other 97% struggled to feed itself. The ideology that promised to eliminate private incentive couldn't survive without it. To understand why, we need to go back to the mandate that remade the countryside. But first, consider hitting that subscribe button so you won't miss our future stories. In 1928, Stalin launched his first 5-year plan with a revolutionary promise: private farming would be abolished. The scattered individual plots that had fed Russia for centuries would be consolidated into vast collective enterprises: kolkhozes owned by peasant cooperatives and sovkhozes directly controlled by the state. This wasn't just agricultural reform. This was ideological warfare against the very concept of private property. Stalin targeted the kulaks first: wealthier peasants who owned slightly more land, a few extra animals, maybe hired seasonal help. In Marxist theory, these kulaks represented capitalism's rural face, the enemy of collective progress. The party's solution was not reform, not taxation. It was elimination. An estimated 5 million people were deported to remote regions, their farms confiscated, their livestock seized. Many were never seen again. The message was clear: resist collectivization, and you disappear. But Stalin's revolution needed more than fear. It needed symbols of progress, proof that collective farming represented humanity's agricultural future. Enter the machine tractor stations, the MTS. These stations would supply modern tractors and combines to collective farms, operated by politically reliable technicians. The machines themselves became propaganda tools, steel embodiments of socialist superiority over backward peasant methods. Soviet newspapers celebrated each new tractor as another victory over capitalist agriculture. The mechanization push served dual purposes. First, it would demonstrate that collective farms could achieve unprecedented productivity through modern technology. Second, it would generate surplus grain for export, financing Stalin's crash industrialization program. The tractors weren't just farming equipment, they were instruments of transformation, designed to prove that central planning could harness technology better than market forces. Yet from the beginning, the machinery revealed the system's fundamental flaws. Tractors arrived at collective farms according to political schedules, not agricultural need. Spring planting waited for party approval. Harvest timing followed bureaucratic calendars rather than crop readiness. The machines that were supposed to liberate agriculture from natural constraints instead chained it to political control. Maintenance became a nightmare. Spare parts moved through the same centralized system that distributed everything else, slowly, unpredictably, often to the wrong locations. A broken drive belt could sideline a tractor for weeks while paperwork crawled through Moscow's bureaucracy. Collective farm managers, judged on meeting production quotas rather than equipment uptime, had little incentive to maintain machines properly. The confiscation process severed knowledge from land. Kulaks, who understood soil conditions, weather patterns, and crop rotation, were eliminated or deported. Their expertise vanished overnight. Collective farm workers, assigned to fields they didn't choose with tools they didn't own, lost the intimate connection between farmer and land that had sustained Russian agriculture for generations. Peasants who had worked their own fields with the dedication of owners now labored on collective land with the motivation of prisoners. Why repair a fence that belonged to everyone and no one? Why stay late to tend sick animals when extra effort brought no extra reward? The machine tractor stations became bottlenecks rather than solutions. Collective farms couldn't repair their own equipment. Only MTS technicians had that authority. But MTS technicians answered to district party officials, not farm managers facing urgent deadlines. A collective farm might watch its grain rot in the field while waiting for a politically approved repair crew. Even when the tractors worked, they worked for the wrong reasons. Operators focused on meeting mechanical quotas, acres plowed per day, fuel consumption targets, hours of operation, rather than agricultural outcomes. The ideology demanded that mechanized collective farming prove its superiority. But the machines, tethered to political control rather than agricultural need, exposed the system's contradictions instead. What followed wasn't efficiency, it was collapse. Peasants saw their world collapsing and made a desperate choice. If the state would seize their animals anyway, better to slaughter them first. Better to eat the meat than watch it march away to collective barns. The slaughter was systematic, devastating, and rational. Families butchered cattle, pigs, sheep, anything the collectives would claim. They salted what they could, traded the rest, consumed what remained. It was a final act of ownership before ownership itself disappeared. Horses, the indispensable muscle of the countryside, were led to the axe rather than to the collective stable. By 1950, the horse population had sunk to around 12.7 million, a grim echo of what had been lost 2 decades earlier. The fields that had been promised mechanized abundance now lacked the basic power to pull a plow. But Stalin's grain quotas didn't adjust for reality. Collective farms still had to deliver their assigned tonnage to the state, regardless of what they'd actually grown. Local officials, terrified of being labeled saboteurs, reported inflated harvest figures to Moscow. These phantom harvests became the basis for real requisitions. The math was murderous. Farms that had grown barely enough to survive were forced to surrender grain they didn't have. Families watched their seed grain disappear into state warehouses, knowing they'd have nothing to plant come spring. The requisition teams took everything: grain, potatoes, even the vegetables drying in peasant cellars. Ukraine bore the worst of it. The famine of 1932 to 1933 claimed millions of lives, a man-made disaster born from ideological stubbornness meeting agricultural reality. Meanwhile, the collective farms introduced a compensation system that guaranteed demoralization. Workers earned labor days based on tasks completed, but payment came only at year's end after the state took its grain quota and farm expenses were covered. Often there was nothing left to distribute. Imagine watching your children grow thin while the grain you harvested disappeared into state warehouses. The connection between effort and reward, the engine that drives all productive work, was severed completely. But the system's most perverse incentive was baked into the pricing itself. Imagine being forced to sell a product you worked all year to grow for less than 3% of its actual market value. That was the impossible economic reality facing every collective farm manager in the Soviet Union. The state's price for rye was a lie. The market signals that had guided agricultural decisions for centuries went dark. State-set prices bore no relationship to production costs or consumer demand. Fixed prices, established in 1929, remained unchanged through the 1950s, even as inflation eroded their value to meaninglessness. Farmers couldn't respond to what people actually wanted because they never learned what that was. Over-reporting became a survival strategy. Local officials inflated production figures to avoid punishment. Farm managers claimed harvests that existed only on paper. The entire system began operating on fictional data, making rational planning impossible. Waste became inevitable. The state paid 8 rubles for grain it sold for 335 rubles. Workers received payment only after impossible quotas were met. Machinery operated according to political schedules rather than agricultural need. Under these conditions, efficiency vanished. Then, on February 17, 1935, came the retreat. The Collective Farm Charter, Stalin's pragmatic admission that ideology alone couldn't feed people. Each collective farm household could maintain a private plot, typically a quarter to half hectare. They could keep a cow, some pigs, chickens. They could grow vegetables, fruit trees, whatever they could manage. It was supposed to be a minor concession, a way to keep peasants fed while the collective system matured. The plots were tiny, barely large enough for a substantial garden, but they came with one crucial difference. Whatever families grew there belonged to them. The contrast in tools told the story. State combines rolled across collective fields, cutting grain that would disappear into quotas and bureaucracy. But behind the cottages, families worked their plots with hoes and hand tools, milking cows by hand, churning butter in wooden churns, storing potatoes in root cellars they dug themselves. These weren't symbols of progress. They were relics of the past, simple tools that connected effort directly to reward. Yet these relics fed people, while the symbols starved them. The moment incentives reappeared, output surged in the smallest places. The compromise was a political retreat, but it was also an immediate, undeniable verdict on the entire Soviet system. The question was, how much more productive could a peasant be when working for himself? The answer arrived almost instantly, and it was devastating to the ideology. By 1938, the statistics were undeniable and deeply embarrassing. Private plots occupied just 3.9% of cultivated land, yet they produced roughly 45% of the Soviet Union's agricultural output. The numbers weren't close. They weren't even in the same universe. Break it down further, and the contradiction became even starker. These tiny household plots delivered 71% of the milk, 70% of the meat, and 52% of the potatoes that Soviet citizens consumed. By the 1960s, the gap had widened further. Private plots were producing 78% of eggs and 64% of potatoes, all from that same sliver of land. The collective farms, sprawling across 96% of the land, with their tractors and combines, couldn't match what families accomplished with hand tools in their backyards. The reason was brutally simple. What I grow is mine. On private plots, the ancient equation of agriculture held true. Work harder, get more. Plant better varieties, harvest better yields. Take care of your cow, get more milk. The connection between effort and reward, severed completely on collective farms, remained intact in these small spaces. Time allocation revealed the truth. Peasants worked twice as many hours on their private plots as they did on collective farm fields, despite the plots being a fraction of the size. They'd fulfill their mandatory labor obligations on the kolkhoz, then rush home to tend gardens that actually fed their families. The collective farms, meanwhile, suffered from what economists call the free rider problem. From the worker's perspective, the math was simple. Why work hard when your extra effort gets distributed among hundreds of other families? Why stay late to repair equipment when the benefit disappears into collective ownership? Individual initiative died when individual reward vanished. Private plots responded to completely different signals. Families could sell surplus vegetables, eggs, and milk in collective farm markets, limited venues where real prices emerged from supply and demand. A dozen eggs might fetch enough rubles to buy soap or fabric. A bucket of potatoes could trade for kerosene or salt. These markets were tiny, heavily regulated, but they provided something the collective system couldn't: feedback. Two agricultural worlds existed side by side, one mechanized and modern, the other traditional and manual. Yet the traditional world consistently outproduced the modern one per unit of land, per hour of labor, per ruble invested. The numbers exposed something deeper than agricultural inefficiency. They revealed the fundamental flaw in Soviet ideology itself. Marxist-Leninist theory claimed that collective ownership would unleash human productive potential, that eliminating private property would create abundance. The household plots proved exactly the opposite. Personal ownership, even of tiny plots, generated more food per acre than vast collective enterprises. Individual incentive, even constrained by regulation, outperformed centralized planning. The very system Soviet ideology sought to eliminate, private property connected to personal reward, was the only thing keeping Soviet agriculture functional. Party officials could see the numbers, but they couldn't acknowledge what they meant. Admitting that private plots outperformed collective farms would undermine the entire theoretical foundation of Soviet socialism. Instead, they tried to manage the embarrassment through careful language and selective statistics. Private agriculture became a temporary expedient, something that would naturally wither away as collective farms matured and improved. The plots were described as supplementary, not essential, even though they supplied the majority of food Soviet families actually ate. The regime saw the numbers and tried to manage the embarrassment. The numbers from the 1940s and 1950s revealed a pricing system so divorced from reality it bordered on absurd. The pricing distortions were extreme. In 1948, documented cases show the Soviet government paying collective farms as little as 8 rubles for 100 kilograms of rye, then selling that same rye to wholesalers for 335 rubles, more than 40 times what the producers received. This wasn't an oversight, it was policy. Prices set in 1929 remained frozen through the 1950s, even as inflation eroded the ruble's value by half or more. Collective farms were essentially forced to subsidize the state's industrial ambitions, surrendering their harvest for payments that covered barely a fraction of production costs. No rational business could survive such terms, but collective farms weren't businesses. They were instruments of state control. The pricing system wasn't designed to reward efficiency or encourage production. It was designed to extract maximum resources for Stalin's industrialization drive, regardless of agricultural consequences. The quota system compounded the damage through economic coercion. Farm managers weren't judged on profitability, efficiency, or even food quality. They were judged solely on meeting numerical targets set by distant bureaucrats who'd never seen their fields. Tons of grain delivered, acres planted, labor days completed. These became the only metrics that mattered. This created perverse incentives throughout the system. Any collective farm that exceeded its production targets faced higher quotas the following year. Success was punished with increased demands. Smart managers learned to meet quotas precisely, never exceed them. Why improve seed varieties when you're only measured on quantity, not quality? Why maintain equipment when you're rewarded for using it, not preserving it? Innovation and efficiency became liabilities rather than assets. The trap was inescapable. Produce more, and your quota increases. Meet your quota exactly, and you're suspected of sandbagging. Miss your quota, and you're labeled a saboteur. The safest strategy was mediocrity, consistent underperformance that avoided both punishment and impossible future demands. Private plots operated under completely different rules. Families responded to actual demand, growing vegetables people wanted to eat, rather than crops that looked good in statistical reports. They sold eggs when prices were high, stored potatoes when markets were flooded. Supply and demand, those fundamental forces of agricultural economics, still functioned in these tiny spaces. The system had created agricultural theater, impressive machinery performing meaningless tasks while real food production happened in backyards with hand tools. Technology, without proper incentives, didn't just fail to improve productivity, it actively hindered it. Leaders oscillated between restricting and relying on the very system they distrusted. When Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev inherited an agricultural system propped up by the very private enterprise it was supposed to eliminate. After Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev finally admitted the truth. The system was broken. He tried to fix it, not by eliminating the private plots directly, but by trying to starve them out. He believed that if collective farms paid better wages, peasants would abandon their small plots on their own. But the result was a political disaster that proved the plots were more essential than ever. From 1953 to 1958, Khrushchev pursued what seemed like agricultural pragmatism. He raised procurement prices, giving collective farms actual money for their grain instead of worthless paper credits. More importantly, he encouraged peasants to expand their private plots and increase their livestock holdings. For the first time since collectivization, families could earn real cash from their household production. The results were immediate and dramatic. Food production surged as peasants responded to genuine incentives, markets filled with vegetables, eggs, and dairy products. Urban workers, accustomed to chronic shortages, suddenly found fresh food available for purchase. Khrushchev had accidentally proven that Soviet agriculture could work when it operated according to market principles rather than ideological mandates. But success created its own problems. The more productive private plots became, the more they embarrassed the collective system. Soviet propaganda couldn't celebrate household gardens without implicitly admitting that collective farms were failures. Worse, peasants began treating their private plots as primary occupations and collective farm work as secondary obligations. By 1958, Khrushchev reversed course. If private agriculture was becoming too successful, it had to be contained. He imposed new restrictions on plot sizes, limited livestock ownership, and consolidated private animals into collective herds. The message was clear: private success threatened socialist orthodoxy. The backlash was swift and predictable. Food availability plummeted as peasants lost their incentive to produce. Urban stores emptied. Rural families, deprived of their household income, struggled to survive on collective farm wages alone. Within 2 years, Khrushchev was forced to retreat from his own restrictions, quietly allowing private plots to expand again. This cycle, encourage, restrict, retreat, became the pattern of Soviet agricultural policy. Leaders needed private production to prevent famine, but couldn't acknowledge its necessity without undermining their entire ideological framework. The statistics told the story Khrushchev couldn't silence. The private sector's dominance had become permanent and undeniable. The productivity gap had become a chasm. Western economists analyzing the Soviet data calculated the true devastating difference in efficiency. It wasn't just a little better. The output per unit of land on a private plot was not 2 times, not 5 times, but an astonishing 13 to 22 times more output per capita than collective farms. This wasn't a marginal difference, it was a fundamental indictment of the entire collective system. Urban workers understood the reality, even if their leaders couldn't admit it. Weekend trains carried city dwellers to rural relatives, returning loaded with vegetables, milk, and eggs from private plots. Urban families maintained their own dachas, small garden plots that supplemented inadequate state food distribution. The entire Soviet food system had become dependent on the private agriculture it officially scorned. Rural families structured their entire economic lives around private production. A household cow provided milk, butter, and cheese, products worth more than a collective farm worker's annual wages. A vegetable garden supplied food for the table and surplus for sale. Chickens produced eggs that could be traded for manufactured goods unavailable through state stores. Meanwhile, the symbols of Soviet agricultural modernity, the massive K700 tractors with their 215 horsepower engines, the enormous combines harvesting thousands of acres, represented impressive engineering applied to a fundamentally broken system. These machines could process grain efficiently, but they couldn't create the incentives that made processing worthwhile. The contrast was visible everywhere. State-of-the-art equipment working vast collective fields that barely fed their operators, while hand-operated cream separators, wooden churns, and root cellars behind peasant cottages stabilized the diets of entire communities. The contradiction hardened into a permanent fixture, visible but unspoken. The collective farm markets became the Soviet Union's economic pressure valves, small spaces where supply and demand could actually function. These weren't grand bazaars, but modest gatherings where peasants brought surplus from their private plots to sell for real money. Here, prices meant something. A dozen eggs commanded whatever buyers would pay, not what Moscow bureaucrats decreed. Potatoes sold for their actual value, not some fictional rate set decades earlier. Milk found its market price through genuine negotiation between seller and buyer. These tiny markets provided what the vast collective system couldn't: honest economic signals. Households operating private plots became microfirms, complete with their own production cycles and resource management. Families developed sophisticated systems for managing manure, rotating crops, and timing livestock breeding. They understood which vegetables grew best in which soil, when to plant for optimal yields, and how to preserve food through winter months. The social contract that emerged was unspoken but understood. The state would tolerate private production to prevent empty shelves and social unrest. Party officials might denounce private agriculture in speeches, but they quietly relied on it to supplement inadequate collective farm output. The cash calculations were stark. Economic studies from the 1950s suggested that collective farm earnings represented barely 1/4 of the income families derived from their private plots. A household cow could generate more annual income than a year of collective farm labor. A productive vegetable garden could provide both food security and trading opportunities that dwarfed official wages. Yet ideologically, private agriculture remained a temporary expedient. Language that persisted for 70 years. Soviet publications consistently described household plots as supplements that would naturally disappear as collective farms matured. This fiction allowed leaders to maintain ideological orthodoxy while depending on the system they claimed to be eliminating. What began as an emergency measure became the system's hidden backbone. Here was the ideological crisis that consumed 7 decades. Marxist-Leninist theory claimed collective ownership would unleash human productive potential, yet private plots consistently proved the opposite. The Communist Party built its legitimacy on eliminating private property, yet couldn't survive without it. The propaganda gap became unbridgeable. Soviet newspapers celebrated collective farm achievements while citizens lined up for bread. Party speeches praised mechanized agriculture, while families depended on backyard gardens for survival. Every statistical report that crossed a party official's desk contained the same embarrassing truth. The system they'd staked their revolution on was being outperformed by the very forces they'd promised to eliminate. The propaganda gap became unbridgeable. Soviet newspapers celebrated collective farm achievements while citizens lined up for bread. Party speeches praised mechanized agriculture while families depended on backyard gardens for survival. Every statistical report that crossed a party official's desk contained the same embarrassing truth. The system they'd staked their revolution on was being outperformed by the very forces they'd promised to eliminate. Technology couldn't compensate for broken incentives. The USSR possessed some of the world's most advanced agricultural machinery, massive tractors, sophisticated combines, entire mechanized systems that represented genuine engineering achievements. But machines amplify human systems, and when those systems reward mediocrity while punishing excellence, even the best equipment fails. By 1990, personal subsidiary farming still produced 26% of Soviet agricultural output, a dependence that never disappeared despite 7 decades of ideological pressure. Individual incentive, confined to tiny plots and constantly threatened with elimination, had outperformed an empire's entire agricultural philosophy. The tractors and combines remained symbols of modernity, but hoes, milk pails, and chicken coops provided the real safety net. Individual incentive, confined to 3% of the land, outperformed an empire's ideology. The Soviet Union built its identity on collective superiority, yet survived on private enterprise it couldn't eliminate. Subscribe for more untold agricultural histories that reveal how human nature shapes the tools we build and the systems we create.